These men were just arrested for planning something absolutely horrific. Gavin Weisenberg and Tanner Thomas of North Texas were arrested after federal investigators uncovered their deranged plan to sail to a Haitian island, massacre every man living there, and turn the women and children into sex slaves. Court documents say they weren't just fantasizing. They were buying a sailboat, gathering weapons, recruiting homeless people as soldiers, and even running crude training drills in rural Texas where they practiced ambushes and mock executions. Prosecutors say they mapped out the island on Google Earth, drafted a post-conquest government, and talked openly about executing the men, breeding the women, and raising enslaved children, all while one of them was coercing a minor into creating explicit material. The FBI foiled the plot before they could leave Texas, but the indictment describes a plan so violent and delusional, it reads like a real-life blueprint for a modern-day genocide. They now face up to life in federal prison if convicted of the conspiracy charge, and up to 30 years for the charges relating to CP. In 2020, Megan Thee Stallion survived an attack that left her bleeding in the street, shot in both of her feet as she tried to walk away from a late-night argument. Bullet fragments tore into the back of her left heel and scattered through the soles of both feet. Injuries so deep that surgeons couldn't remove all the shrapnel, and pieces are still lodged inside her body. The man she identified as the shooter was later convicted and sentenced, but Megan has said the worst part wasn't the pain. It was being viciously mocked online by people who insisted she was lying, exaggerating, or milking the incident while she was recovering from gunshot wounds. In 1910 Los Angeles, a woman named Miss Bell had been searching for her missing Scotch Terrier for weeks when her friend G.E.C. Wright stumbled upon the answer by pure nightmare coincidence. The man was having a hot dog for lunch when he suddenly bit down on something hard, a small metal object hidden deep inside his meal. When he fished it out and wiped it clean, he immediately froze. Stamped on the metal was the identification number of Miss Bell's missing dog. Only then did he realize the horrific truth. The dog had somehow been cooked into the meat of a local hot dog stand. This is real footage of the most dangerous object humans have ever created, the elephant's foot inside the ruins of Chernobyl. It looks like a lump of rock, but it's actually corium, a molten mixture of uranium fuel, concrete, steel, and reactor parts that fused together when Reactor 4 tore itself apart in 1986. When this mass formed, it was so radioactive that standing near it for a mere few seconds delivered a fatal dose. In those first few hours, the elephant's foot wasn't just deadly to anyone who approached. It was still hot enough chemically and thermally that if it had burned through the foundation and hit the water reservoirs beneath the plant, it could have triggered a massive steam explosion. Soviet scientists warned that the blast would have torn open the remaining reactors and sent an uncontrollable cloud of nuclear fallout across most of Europe, rendering entire countries uninhabitable. The only reason that didn't happen is because liquidators, many of whom died horribly later on, managed to drain the water and seal the lower levels in time. Early attempts to photograph the elephant's foot were catastrophic. The radiation shredded camera film and interfered with electronics, leaving warped, blistered images where the object barely looked real. Simply entering the corridor meant almost certain death for the human body. The footage shown comes from 1996, 10 years after the accident, where the radiation had dropped just enough for a brief, tightly controlled visit. But it was still extremely dangerous. By then, the mass was emitting mostly alpha radiation, particles that can't penetrate skin yet become lethal if even a single speck is inhaled. The team used ventilation, masks, and moved quickly, knowing the room was still one of the most radioactive places on the planet. Nearly 4 decades later, the elephant's foot remains where it formed. It's much cooler now, but still too radioactive to touch, too heavy to move, and too toxic to ever be safely dismantled. It stands as a permanent monument to a disaster that nearly poisoned half a continent. An elementary school outing in British Columbia turned into absolute chaos on November 20th, 2025, when a grizzly bear suddenly charged a group of 4th and 5th graders from a wall to school as they paused on a riverside trail. 11 people were injured during the attack, including 2 children who were rushed to the hospital in critical condition, while 7 others were treated at the scene. Teachers fought the bear off with bear spray and a bear banger, likely preventing multiple deaths. The bear soon escaped back into the forest and has still not been found. And officials say they don't know what triggered the attack or whether the animal will strike again. What's especially unsettling is that the attack happened to a group large enough that grizzlies normally avoid entirely, suggesting something was deeply wrong with the monstrous animal. And until conservation officers track it down, the entire valley remains on edge, knowing an injured and unpredictable grizzly bear is still lurking somewhere in the shadows. In 2017, 22-year-old YouTuber Pedro Ruiz III tried to film a stunt where a hardcover encyclopedia would stop a .50 caliber round from a Desert Eagle. He had already tested the trick once before with a smaller gun, giving him the confidence to try it again, this time asking his pregnant girlfriend Mona Lisa Perez to fire from just a foot away. But the .50 cal round tore straight through the encyclopedia and into his chest, killing him instantly as two cameras recorded the stunt and their 3-year-old daughter stood nearby. Family members later said they'd warned him these viral stunts would get him killed. Perez pleaded guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 180 days in jail, and their unborn son was later named after Pedro. In Tampa, Florida, a long-lost cemetery quietly vanished from records for nearly a century, until a local newspaper traced old land deeds and realized a public housing complex had been built directly on top of it. When archaeologists scanned the ground with radar, they found over 100 graves still buried under the apartment complex in perfectly neat rows. The housing authority later confirmed they wouldn't disturb the bodies. Instead, they began relocating residents and announced plans to turn the land into a memorial park for the forgotten dead. 28-year-old Brittany Zamora was an award-winning elementary school teacher from Arizona. That was until she was sentenced to 20 years in prison for raping one of her 13-year-old students. Her attorney blamed the student for the teacher's crimes, arguing that the boy was a teenager, not a child. A woman from Germany was sentenced to 7 years in prison after dropping her newborn baby daughter out of her apartment window. She apparently thought that having a child would ruin her career as an executive for Porsche. In 1996, Charles Whitman murdered 17 people with a sniper at the University of Texas before being killed by police. In a note he left behind, Whitman requested an autopsy since he felt something was seriously wrong with his brain. He'd been having severe fits of rage that he'd never experienced before and could not explain. The autopsy found that Whitman had a small tumor pressing up against his amygdala, the part of the brain that regulates fear and aggression. This likely contributed to his sudden erratic behavior. Legendary actor Rick Moranis was at the height of his career when his wife developed cancer and passed away in 1991. He slowly took less and less acting roles before completely retiring from acting so that he could instead devote his time to raising his kids as a single father. American doctor Chester Southam injected his patients with cancer without their consent to see how their bodies would react. Even after his horrific experiments were uncovered, Chester went on to become president of the American Association for Cancer Research. In 2003, pizza delivery man Brian Wells wore a collar bomb around his neck to rob a PNC bank in Pennsylvania. Police would later arrest him and leave him sitting on the ground while they waited for the bomb squad. Just moments before the bomb squad arrived, the bomb detonated on live TV, killing Wells instantly. Investigators later concluded that Wells was a willing participant in the robbery, but was told by his acquaintances that the bomb was fake. On May 2, 2001, John Battaglia lured his two daughters, 9-year-old Faith and 6-year-old Liberty, to his Dallas apartment for what was supposed to be a routine visitation, even though he was already wanted for violating probation after threatening their mother, Mary Jean Pearl. Furious that she had reported him, he called her on speaker and forced the girls to the phone so that she could hear everything. As Mary Jean begged them to run away, Faith's last words were, "No, Daddy, please don't do it," followed by the sound of multiple gunshots. Battaglia shot both girls with a .45 caliber revolver, then calmly left the apartment, went to a tattoo shop, and had 2 roses inked on his arm to honor them. When police arrived, the girls were found posed and surrounded by their toys. Battaglia showed no remorse at trial, smirked at the prosecutors, and even blew kisses at spectators in the courtroom. He was sentenced to death and eventually executed in 2018, calling himself the happiest man alive moments before the injection. This was the photo that gave police hope they might find James Bulger alive, but instead, it became one of the most haunting crime photos ever taken. In February of 1993, 2-year-old James Bulger disappeared. In the 2 seconds his mother let go of his hand in a Liverpool shopping center, and police initially felt relieved when security footage showed him leaving with 2 young boys, not an adult predator, but that relief quickly diminished as they slowly learned the horrific truth. Over the next 2 hours, 10-year-olds John Venables and Robert Thompson dragged James through back streets, kicked and punched him, threw him onto his head, smeared paint in his eye, force-fed him batteries, pelted him with bricks and stones, and beat him with a 22-pound iron bar. At one point, they tried to push him into traffic, and several witnesses later admitted they didn't intervene because they assumed James was their younger brother. Their assaults left 42 separate injuries, including multiple skull fractures so extensive pathologists couldn't determine how or when James died. The boys then placed his body across train tracks to stage an accident, and a train later severed him, destroying critical evidence and delaying the discovery of the truth. When police identified the killers, expecting a violent man, not two 10-year-olds, veteran officers said it was the most disturbing revelation of their careers. Both were sentenced to detention and released at 18 with lifelong anonymity, but Venables has since returned to prison multiple times for child abuse material, while Thompson has not reoffended, though he spent years blaming James's mother for the horrific murder, saying she never should have let go of his hand.